Thanks for joining us, everyone. I am happy to welcome you to our career profile event this afternoon, and I want to introduce our speaker, Windy López-Aflitto. She is Vice President for Content and Partnership at Learning Heroes, which is a nonprofit organization that works to help parents support their children's educational and developmental success. That's her current position, but Windy has a fascinating career trajectory. She'll tell you a little bit about her background and she studied Spanish, and Spanish has played a role in shaping her career path. And our goal this afternoon is for you to get some ideas about what can you do when you study Spanish? Where can Spanish take you? We all know you can become a Spanish teacher, you can become a translator. Those are some of the more obvious outcomes, but Windy helps us see a bigger vision of what can possibly happen when you pursue studying Spanish. So let me start, Windy, by asking you if you could just tell us a little bit about your background with the Spanish language. Did you hear it at home, learn it in the classroom, study abroad?
Yeah. So first, thank you all for joining. I know it's late in the day. It's always such a pleasure to speak with Montclair students. And thank you, Anne and Maria Jose, for having me. So I grew up as a proud first generation Latina, Colombian American. When I was younger, my parents themselves were just learning the language. I was in kindergarten, I had predominantly spoken Spanish at home. So I was actually an ELL student in kindergarten. And by second grade, this is how quick, kids are sponges. By second grade, I would say that I was struggling to hold on to my Spanish because as a family, and this happens to a lot of, I think, immigrant families, we were focused on learning English together. And so and I say this to my parents all the time, particularly my mom, who took us back to Colombia almost every summer. I really appreciate and truly value that exposure, not just to the language, but to the culture. And it was really those summers in Colombia that allowed me, I think, to have a decent foundation in Spanish to then go on. And as you mentioned, I can share more on that, but I minored in college in Spanish.
Sorry, what was your major in college?
So I was a communications major and minor in Spanish literature.
Okay. And did you ever have a study abroad experience as part of your?
So interestingly, I did not while I was in college, and we'll get into this on sort of my nonlinear career path that has always been focused on education, sort of the intersection of education, communication, and Spanish. When I made probably the biggest sort of career change, I changed from communications to then went back to school for an alternate route in education. So that's when you get your, a degree in teaching while you're in education while you're teaching. During that transition, I lived in Spain for a year and I taught Spanish there. So that was, okay.
Yeah. So you mentioned that when you started school or after a few years in school by second grade, that your English was stronger than your Spanish and you were struggling to keep your Spanish. What was it that motivated you to continue with Spanish, to make sure that you hung on to it? What motivated you to pursue that?
Yeah, I think, in my younger years, it was definitely that connection to my family and my culture. There were summers where we would come back, where we would leave, in the beginning, going to Colombia with still struggling to speak Spanish. And by the end of the summer, we would come back just wanting to speak Spanish to our friends. So I would say that was certainly the motivation. But, now, fast forward, I continue to be motivated by professionally, how it's helped me. And now as a parent, also trying my best to pass that along to my children. Despite I'm married to an Italian American, so trying to raise them bilingually, is challenging. But again, there's the motivation of both the language and also the culture.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you got a minor in Spanish in college, and once you graduated, you taught in Spain for a while. What was your first job once you got out of college? And did Spanish play any role in that? And then kind of just give us an outline of where you've worked and the kind of positions you've held over the years.
Yeah. So Spanish has played a role in all of my jobs. As I mentioned, I've had a sort of a nonlinear path, always focused on education. So to give you a sort of a timeline for out of college, I think, really lucky. I got a job for a pretty reputable PR firm, working on, at the time, they had just landed the McDonald's account, which they were still sort of small, mid-sized PR firm. It was a really big deal for them. And I got a lot of opportunity to really rise quickly on the team working on the McDonald's account because of my Spanish. So I was the only Spanish speaking team member. And at a very young age, I was helping with not just, we had a translator, right? Because I'm not an official translator. And I would say, quite frankly, my written Spanish is not perfect. And so I know I was eyes wide open about that. So we would have translators help us with, let's say, the press releases, but I was able to be really successful the McDonald's account included educational campaigns and promoting college, in particular, scholarships and early literacy programs for Latino children. And so I was able to bring a couple of things. One is just the knowledge of the cultural piece, right, which I think is important. And I was able to really quickly share new ideas and be successful at things like pitching the news media in Spanish. And so, early on in my career, I got big placements in El Diario and in other places. And, interestingly, that the media piece has continued to be part of my trajectory. But even though I really liked and was being successful in that PR world, I quickly realized that that wasn't my career choice. I didn't want to stay in PR. And so I was really interested in the education piece of the programs that I was supporting. My mom's a teacher, so I've always had that influence in my life. But I also knew that I didn't want to teach forever. I just sort of knew that. I think it takes, honestly, I think teaching is one of the most noble professions. It takes a very special person to be a good teacher for an entire career. And so I decided, after about 5 years in PR, in public relations, to make a change. 9/11 happened. I was about 25 and I just wasn't happy. And so I decided to move abroad to Spain. I did a TOEFL certification and I taught English. I think earlier I said I taught Spanish. I said I taught Spanish, or I taught English there for a year, with the intention of seeing if I liked teaching, right? Like seeing, just one, having the opportunity to live abroad, since I did not get to do that more for sort of financial reasons, quite honestly, while I was in college, but also to see if I would be interested in teaching. And so after a year of teaching English there, I came back and did alternate route, getting a degree in education while teaching at a charter school. And at that charter school, I taught Spanish. And from there went on to teach second grade as a classroom teacher. But you'll see that Spanish always played a role in that transition to sort of figuring out my path in sort of, again, merging communications, education, and Spanish. After fast track, after teaching for several years, again, I sort of knew from the beginning that having that teaching experience would give me that background that is critical, right, to be taken seriously, or to be able to do other things in education. So it was in my second teaching job, I taught at a charter school, first in Hoboken, teaching Spanish, and then I went on to teach second grade as a core teacher in the Bronx at a charter school. And it was in that experience that I had the opportunity to do home visits. There was a big focus on what's called in education family engagement. So that means really extending yourself into the community and getting to know families in order to better support students. And I immediately became passionate. That for me was my aha moment. It was my sort of nonlinear path led me to that moment, right? And I said, this is what I wanted to do. And I, before having had that experience, I didn't know family engagement was a field. I did more digging and ended up getting a job at Scholastic, doing the publishing company, doing family engagement. So creating family literacy initiatives sort of from the ground up, partnering with locally community organizations, with schools, with libraries, often in urban communities or rural communities, using my Spanish, again, because all of the programs that we did were bilingual, were sort of bicultural, were very much about elevating families' strengths and their what's called their funds of knowledge, right, around their culture. So I really used my Spanish in that first role, sort of in family engagement. I was at Scholastic for 10 years and have some of my best and proudest moments in my career were there because the work that we did was about elevating Latino families in many cases, and just about doing good work for students and for families. So I was there for about 10 years, had there the opportunity to really, again, bring together communications, education, and Spanish. So for example, we can get into this with when folks have questions, but I worked really closely, for example, with the public relations department there. Because I had that background in PR, because I was a teacher, I was able to share ideas in different contexts. So if we were, let's say, working in a community and we wanted to raise awareness around the good work that we were doing or that a community was doing, I would work with the PR team on, what that media outreach would look like or what the messaging was. And on the flip side of that, on the content side, I worked with the editorial team based on what we were learning in the community. What were some of the improvements that we could make on the programs, again, in English and in Spanish. So that was a great experience. After about 10 years, I decided I wanted to have a family, and I traveled a lot for that job. And so I knew I needed to make a change. And after 10 years, I was just eager for something new. And the other area that had interested me, as part of being interested in staying within family engagement and education, was philanthropy, because of a lot of the kind of work that I was doing in community affairs and family engagement is funded by philanthropy. I thought that would round out my experience. So I went on from Scholastic to work at American Express Foundation in the philanthropy group, doing as a program manager, providing grants for nonprofit leadership development. I would say of all my roles that in that area, I say I didn't use my Spanish as much, but I did also there work with the PR team on when we were doing press releases and doing media outreach around our philanthropic efforts. Anything related to Spanish, I would sort of give counsel on or collaborate with them on. So I was at American Express Foundation, was able to have my first child and sort of stay put. I think that's, as we talk about career paths, that's something to consider, right? And I loved traveling for those, 10 plus years, but then there comes a time when, you want to prioritize family. So I think that's also something to consider, and that Spanish can help with because there are so many great international jobs. So after being at American Express for just about 2.5 years, that was actually one of my shortest jobs, I got a call from a woman that I used to work with at Scholastic. I think one of my messages also is that, make good relationships and stay connected with folks, because that is the way the world works nowadays. And so I got a call from a woman who I had only crossed paths with for a couple of years at Scholastic. But she called me and said, I started this nonprofit on family engagement. We're about a year in. I thought of you, and I would love to talk to you about creating a role like just for you, like based on what I know about you, where we're going. And, and she said, the tricky part is that I can't guarantee a job for more than a year, because she was brand new. It was a small nonprofit. She was actively, fundraising but establishing this nonprofit. And so, I had this 2-year-old baby. My husband said, "Are you crazy? You have a nice, comfortable job at American Express. Why would you make this change?" And I said, because this is my passion. Like I missed that close connection with family engagement and education. And so I took a leap of faith, I followed my gut. I think that's another important something that has really helped me throughout my careers. I feel like I have a strong gut on my next, even if it's not apparent immediately. And so I took a leap of faith, and that was 5.5 years ago. Learning Heroes is going strong. We've become one of the leaders in family engagement research. My role has continued to evolve, and I've grown and professionally and as a person because of being in an entrepreneurial environment. I've always worked for big name, like either schools or Scholastic or American Express. And we are a small, nimble team where if we come up with an idea, we go and we fundraise for it and we do it. And in this role, Spanish has played a huge part, both again, sort of culturally, everything that we create and that we do is through an asset-based lens that is about strengthening, that is about elevating family strengths, particularly Latino and African-American families. And on the Spanish side, I'm able to work really closely. We have an official translator who does all of our content and resources, but I work really closely with her to make sure that we're on tone, that it's informal, that, that it's sort of on brand, if you will. And then also, fun fact, though it doesn't make me comfortable, I've also, because I'm the only Spanish speaker in our team, and because I lead our content and our parent-facing work, I do a lot of interviews on Univision. They are a core partner. They have become really good friends of mine, actually, personally. And so that's been a fun growth because that's not my comfort zone. I'm very much a doer. I'm a behind the scenes. I love to write. I like to, dig deep into research. And so it's good to be stretched sometimes. And that's an example of sometimes I would say that being able to do that has helped me and has helped our organization in ways that I've used Spanish. So I've gone on too long and I don't want to bore these poor students. But as you can see, there's been ebbs and flows, all with a very consistent focus on how I could merge communications, education, and Spanish has always been a through line, I would say, in my career path.
I think you have the most interesting story, and I love that it gives us such a broad view of what a career is now. It's not get a job and stay there till you're 65. You can keep growing, you can keep trying things, and one thing leads to another. And you had some really great takeaways I was just wishing I had a little thing to quote you as you went through with some of your advice. I have a couple more questions, and I'd like to ask our students to be thinking about things you'd like to ask Windy. So what I wanted to mention was that we've changed our major to reduce the number of credits so that it's easier for students to double major in Spanish and in something else. You've been talking this whole time about how you've combined the language with other fields. And so I wanted to ask, are there other majors that you see as a particularly good combination for a student who's majoring in Spanish when they're thinking about entering the workforce?
Yeah,
I think it depends on their abilities and interests, but
quite frankly, I think the sky's the limit. We are living in such a global, international world, and just even domestically, right? Like there's Spanish speakers we're no longer a minority. But I would say off of the top of my head, communications for sure, business, especially with so much growth happening, which is exciting for me as a Colombian American in Latin America. There is so much social innovation that is, in addition to business, I would say, social innovation happening in Latin America. And when I was at Scholastic, we had library foundations from Texas going to Colombia, and this was many years ago, to visit and see their models of social innovation with libraries in marginalized communities. And I didn't go on that trip at the time, but I did provide, I helped them sort of unpack it because they were with a translator. There was no Spanish speaking team from the American team and the Texas team that went to Colombia. So I would say business, social innovation, communications, and I would say also medicine, right? I think there's a lot happening. And, in the context of COVID, we have seen how, some of the things that we're facing as a world, it can't be resolved. It's a global context, both in the challenges and in the solutions that we're coming up with. So I really think that it's really broad, and obviously also education would be another big one, I guess, because it's closest to my path. But I think there's certainly a lot of opportunity. And I think, as you said, like my takeaways is that skills, you can make changes even within sort of that major, and leveraging your core skill sets. So, regardless of what you end up matching as sort of a major, know that, like you said, the world it doesn't work that way anymore, where you just get one, just because you studied, medicine doesn't mean that you can't go on to be an entrepreneur in the medical space, right? Or a business person.
You kind of led into my very last question. It's just general advice. You've offered advice along the way, but if you had to wrap it up in just, 3 or 4 pieces of really concrete advice, especially for students who are thinking about, who've already decided to major in minor in Spanish, or who are thinking about it, what would your pitch be to sell Spanish to them?
Yeah, I would say, and seeing it as truly a complementary role. And I don't mean that in a way that it doesn't have to be your primary focus, right? Because certainly I know you'll be having sessions on, like you said, like translation or other areas where, like a Spanish teacher, my mom's a Spanish teacher, she actually just retired, and that's a beautiful career. But I would say that, you can also consider how it can complement and sort of round out. For me, it very much has been a through line. And I would say that, some other, takeaways are, look at Spanish the way you look at other skill sets. Again, because those, knowing and being confident about what your areas of strength are and your areas of growth will be part of will help you navigate change, not be afraid of change, and look for change, right? Like, there were points in my career where, again, I didn't mention this, and it's a good segue to my next takeaway. There were at 2 points in my career, I actually took a pay cut. When I changed from PR to going into education, I took a pretty significant pay cut, and I didn't share. I mean, I think I shared that with my family, but for me, it was more like, I knew that I wasn't happy, right? For me, money has never been my core driver. And for some people it is, and that's okay. But knowing what's important to you, for me, and my father used to always say this, like, if you find a career that you love, you won't work a day in your life. And I think that is so true. I love what I do. It makes me happy. It fulfills me as a person. So knowing what matters to you, if it is that success and that power and that, that financial return, that's great. And there's paths for that. If it isn't, if it's more, or if it's a combination, just knowing what is going to fulfill you as a person, and then paying attention to the skill sets that will help you make those transitions, I think is really important. For me, and I have friends who have been really successful, a lawyer friend in particular, who hates what he does. And he says, I will never allow my children to go down the lawyer route. And that's just I'm just giving an example, right? But just being mindful that sometimes in the end, the motivations that you might have had as a young person, they might change. Or you might realize, really at the end of the day, it's about being fulfilled as a person. The other takeaway I would say, and I alluded to this earlier, is, really just following your gut on what will make you happy, what will make, and sometimes that means taking risks. Sometimes that means taking a comfortable move. I certainly did that when I went to American Express. It was a safe move. I needed at that time a 9 to 5 where I was not traveling, not a 8 a.m. When I was at Scholastic, literally it was like 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. days, and loved every minute of it, but it was exhausting, stressful at times. So yeah, following your gut on what you need at the time to do your job best. And then I would also, and again, alluded to this earlier, is the world, it runs on relationships. Relationships are so important. And I don't know that I fully understood that early on in my career. And I mention that because I am by nature more of an introvert. I have always had a small group of friends. I'm not, again, I mentioned I'm sort of a behind the scenes person. I'm married very much to an extrovert, and he has literally never looked for a job online. But this is like the difference, right? Because he's such a relational person. All of his jobs and transitions have been through contacts. And it's been actually through his experience that I've realized, like, making sure that you're on LinkedIn and that you are staying connected with folks. And I've always had good references because I've always had successful, I would say, or tried to do my best in careers, but in my jobs. But really, I think that's the way the world works nowadays. Is that those relationships are really key.
Thank you so much, Wendy. We're getting some comments and questions
Yeah,
in
I
the
know. I was
chat.
just trying to look in there. Yeah.
So let's first we have Liam, who says thank you very much for the information. His first question is, how did you maintain to have a relationship with the companies that you work for? And then how do you keep yourself informed of new job opportunities within your market?
Yeah. So again, this is something that I've really learned throughout the years. I've deep and close relationships with several people that I worked with, in particular at Scholastic and on. And that has been ranged from friendships to more mentor kind of relationships. One of my greatest mentors was a woman who I worked for, and then when I left, we've remained in touch, and from a distance remains my mentor. I think, what's important as it relates to relationships is truly having that relationship. And doesn't mean you have to check in all the time, but making sure that it's not always about an ask, right? So, because that can become really transactional. So, if remembering something about, whether it's a birthday or, just checking in on how somebody is doing, or, I'll give a concrete example. My boss at American Express recently left, and I saw that he posted that on LinkedIn, and I immediately not only made a post on his LinkedIn, but I reached out to him via email just to check in, because I knew that was going to be a very big change for him. And so we exchanged emails, and I'm going to now sort of serve on, he's convening some folks on a project that we had all worked on together. So I'm just making sure that it's two-way, that it's reciprocal, like any other relationship, right? That it's not just transactional, because people can see through that when you just reach out when you want a job or a favor or a reference in particular.
Thank you very much. What about keeping informed of new job opportunities within your market? Would you say that's through relationships as well, or are there other means of?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn continues to be a great place. I know there's other websites that are more geared toward distinct fields on jobs. For me, another important way to know is just to be informed on the trade, the news, trade news, right? So for me, I watch really carefully the education trades to know what's happening, in organizations like mine. Just being mindful of changes that are happening in that field will help who's up and coming, who's had issues, who's letting people go. So beyond just job postings, I think just being keeping up to date with changes in the market. But yes, absolutely, I do think relationships are key.
Thank you. Erica has a comment. I've been an elementary school teacher for 5 years now, and throughout my years, I've started to gain a love for Spanish and the language, which led me back to school. But also, more importantly, I had gone with my dad to take his citizenship test, and they didn't have enough translators that day that they asked me to do it. And that gave me a sense of purpose and fulfillment, like you just mentioned, which has given me new ideas on what a new career path can be for me, where I'm using the language a lot more. So thank you for making
That's great.
Yeah,
I know we have to find what fulfills us, I think, as human beings. And I will just say, while I'm not an expert in translation, I have, as I had mentioned, worked with translators throughout my career in almost every job. And there are so many, being a freelancer, our freelancer right now for Learning Heroes, she has a great life, right? She has several clients. She manages her schedule. She takes on projects that she wants to, or she can say no. And she tells me all the time, she's like, I love working on yourself because it makes me feel, she feels connected to it, right? So there's so much that you can do with translation. So I just wanted to sort of put a pin in that as well.
Other questions, either in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and ask your question or make a comment. And make sure you have a chance to. Wendy's a great resource, and so I want to take advantage of the opportunity to pick her brain and get her advice. Or anybody have anything they want to ask or share? Claudia, go ahead, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Yes, hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for everything you share. I guess this is I would guess what would you suggest to someone? You mentioned something that perhaps your writing wasn't your strength. You know, and I know that sometimes you know, here in the US growing up, some of us might have the strength of being more verbally being able to talk. Some people are much better at reading. Some people are much better at writing.
Yeah.
While I think all of the aspects are important, of course, would you say that when you take on a job where you do have to speak Spanish, even in the areas where you might be a little bit weak at, or maybe not your strength, I would just say that just the experience itself, like you've mentioned, you've been working with translators. Perhaps you were not doing that job, but you do have knowledge in Spanish. Would you say that just working with them, regardless of your written Spanish or the areas that might have been your weakness, would you say that that helped a lot? And I guess not to be discouraged, even if you might not have a particular strength in the Spanish language. You know, how did the influences around you, knowing where your weakness was, like help you stay motivated, or what helped you to keep going, especially if your writing was not at its best?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things, and you just made me think of something else that I would want to mention, is that I think when you're making, especially early on in your career and throughout, for me, transparency and honesty has, I think, serves me well, right? So I've always been upfront that like I'm a strong writer in English, and that's always been, so it's very central to my role right now, is writing content and creating resources and helping write research reports. But being honest, when I was hired, that I can speak Spanish, I can work with the translator, but I am not an official translator. I think, you know, that's important, right? Because you never want to put yourself in a situation where you are struggling or that you overpromised. And I think that can sometimes be really easy to do, let's be honest, on interviews. And I will also say that because I was honest, what I have found is, while I work with translators because, you know, sort of grammatically, or, you know, I would always want sort of an expert Spanish writer, I have, and she'll often, it's a collaboration. So because I'm the person that writes the core content in English, I have sort of, and because it's all research based, because we create content based on what we learn from families, there's plenty of times where I'm like, actually, Marta, that sort of lost its intended message in the translation. So I can read, I can write, I can speak. So I can make sure that translation, I add the content, if you will, or the context. And she values that because she doesn't have all of the context on why it was written a certain way, if that makes sense. So you can add value sometimes, even in areas that you may not be the lead. So in that case, I am the lead in creating the content. I am the support as it relates to the written Spanish, but that doesn't mean that I'm not that core, I guess, knowledge or the context that I bring can't support that Spanish translation. And I think that can happen in a lot of different scenarios, right? So I'll give another example. We're a small team at Learning Heroes. So while we are, you know, responsible for our distinct roles, we support each other. And a lot of our work is done sort of truly in a team effort, right? So our communications, for example, I technically report to the SVP of communications. And because I have that PR background, I often will chime in and give either support to our social media team or our communications team. It's not my role. I don't have to do that, but I am providing support, right? I'm the secondary, not the lead on that, but I can provide support. So I guess where I'm going is like, I would say absolutely. I would say, be honest and lean into, just because it might not be the core of what your role is, it doesn't mean that you can't provide substantive and important work in that area.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat from Michelle. Any advice on how to take that leap into a new career path without knowing the outcome?
Yeah, I think this is where I say, the gut piece, why following your gut is really important. Having good faith in that sometimes we take risks in life, but also on the more practical side is doing your research, right? Like doing your homework, if you will. So knowing or making sure that you're at least creating the environment for yourself where you can make that transition, even if you don't know the outcome, that you are following the steps that will get you to a positive outcome. And that can include mentors, that can include exploring different kinds of paths, or because there are so many great examples nowadays, because this is, the advantage of social media, where you can look up, and to be quite honest, I'm sort of a private social media person. So I post mostly for work. I don't post a lot of pictures of my kids or personally, but the advantage of social media is that you can go on LinkedIn and see people's different kinds of career paths. What have they done, right? Where have they ended up? And you can be inspired by that, to take risks sometimes. Informed risks, I would say.
We have a question from a current 101 student. She says, thanks for all your life experience and knowledge. I'm learning Spanish 101 for the first time. What tips can you give?
Oh, Spanish 101 for the first time. I would say have patience and be persistent, right? Learning a language is not easy, but it's also, I think, really motivating. Try and find different ways to round out your experience, right? So this is going to state the obvious, but TV and music and culture, to keep you motivated on those days where like the grammar might feel overwhelming. And I will say that when I say that my written Spanish, it's often like the grammar piece for me. But yeah, I would say try and treat it as not just the language piece, but try and be motivated by the culture that is attached to the language. And there's so many ways to be exposed to that.
That's great advice. As someone who teaches one-on-one, I think that's great advice. Any other comments or questions, either in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and ask. Okay, well, thank you so much, Windy, for taking your time to share your experience with us. And it's great to hear people's stories of how they end up where they are, and just seeing that Spanish, there are lots of places that Spanish can take you and can be supported, can support other, a whole variety of careers. And so I have always, every time you speak, I'm always inspired by the changes you make and some gutsy decisions to change careers. And so thank you very much for sharing all that with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And now that, Em, when you mentioned that, I'm thinking about it. I think that I've spoken at Montclair since when I was at Scholastic, then when I was at American Express, and now Learning Heroes. So I feel like I've kind of grown up sharing my story with your students, which is fun.
I feel I knew parts of it as you were going through. I don't remember. So
yeah. It's always a pleasure. And I will just say, we didn't talk that much about the current environment. I don't know if the folks on the line are, sophomores or, seniors, or where you are in your studies. But I want to just acknowledge that, the past 2 years have been really hard for everyone. And certainly for all of us, as whether it's, as students or as professionals. And I think it's an exciting time that we're all coming out of this, and folks are, what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of energy around creating job environments that are good for organizations and also good for employees. So you're, stepping out back into the world, I think at a time where I'm really hoping that we'll take, and the silver linings, a little bit cliche, but there are some silver linings coming out of this pandemic, where companies are being really innovative around how to support employees and their professional growth and their personal growth. So don't be discouraged, I guess.
So you inspired one more question. Was there a time in your career where you were grateful you knew how to communicate in Spanish, especially working with families?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, throughout, I would say in particular, the most personal moments were when I was teaching. And I said, as I mentioned, when I had the opportunity to do those home visits and work with the families of my students, that for me was the aha when I realized I wanted to do family engagement. And I saw my own story, even though it wasn't identical. In many ways, I saw my own story as, growing up with immigrant parents who just wanted us to succeed, right? Like they worked night and day, literally, so that we could have a life filled with happiness, right? And fulfillment, not just an opportunity for education, but just to be our best selves. And unfortunately, we didn't touch that much on this, but a big part of my career since then has also just been focused on elevating those that are often marginalized. And so being able to communicate with these Spanish-speaking families who often don't have a voice in our education system or in our communities just helped me feel like I was like a small piece of doing what I could to elevate what I knew were, families who were just trying their best. They just maybe didn't know how to navigate the education system or how to support at home. So for me, I would say that was probably the most moving and sort of career, that was a career changing moment for me. And then at Scholastic too, I mean, I worked with so many communities where I was just grateful. And I would say by grateful was that I also learned. There wasn't a time when I wouldn't like go to a community and, do a family engagement workshop, whether it was at, a community center, at a church or a library, because we were doing truly community-based work where I didn't learn something. So I was grateful that I was able to sort of be that bridge to elevate their voice in their room. But I always walked away having learned something and feeling that much more energized and motivated.
So important that your work be meaningful, feel meaningful and be meaningful. And it seems like you've had a path that's been full of that. So, all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's nice to have you here. And thank you again, Windy. Can we express our thanks to Windy? You can applaud with whatever. Say thank you. We've got to.
We can do. I'll do a little heart emoji.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you all so much.